Christina Rowe was 28-year-old. She'd grown up in the city of Angles in the Philippines. Her dad was British, so in 2017-2018, she decided to move to the UK with her daughter to create a better life. And she worked super hard to create that better life. She was working at the House of Fraser department store, and then on top of that she had a cleaning job, and she was also a part-time model. The people that knew her said that she was sweet, caring, loving, thoughtful and talented. She loved to read, make music and dance. She was very intellectual and spiritual, a deep thinker, and she dreamed to be a writer. A friend that she had that was a photographer said she had always been very mysterious. She kept to herself a lot and was quite quiet. She was very special and a unique person. Life to Christina was very magical. There was no controlling her. She followed her own beat. It was like a tornado that you hope to get swept away in. Christina's daughter plays quite a big role in this, and I'm not allowed to mention her name because she's only 8, and I wouldn't really want to mention her name anyway. So, for the purposes of keeping her identity sealed, we're going to call her D, short for daughter. And on that note, I'll add my usual disclaimer. This is a real story involving real people, and then real people have real families. So although I do want you to share and comment, please do so with sensitivity. Christina Rowe first met Charles Byrne in December 2019. It was on the Tinder dating app. Yeah, I know, at this point I don't know why anyone would use a dating app. They're definitely braver than me. 25-year-old Charles were obviously 3 years younger than Christina. And honestly, I couldn't find all that much about him. He liked to play guitar apparently, and he referred to himself as Charlie. Charles and Christina started dating. At one point, they even lived together for 6 months. But their relationship came to an end. And in February 2021, Charles was living at his family home on Waterworks Road. Christina at the time is living on Cheviot Close. Both these addresses are in Worchester, and obviously Christina is living on her own with her daughter. Now it's claimed that Charles quite often turned up at Christina's house in the middle of the night, and that's exactly what he did in February 2021. It was in the early hours of Wednesday the 10th of February 2021. When he arrived at the house, Dee was asleep upstairs and Charles had a suitcase with him. It's thought that Christina let him into the house. Not long after, in the kitchen, a scuffle broke out and Charles lost his temper. He strangled Christina and then stabbed her. In his own words, he said, "Her lips turned blue, and then I just kept holding on. I thought I'd try and make it quick, so I put a knife in her chest." He then put Christina into the suitcase. At some point during all of his commotion, Dee heard her mom and Charles screaming at each other, so as inquisitive and curious as kids are, she came down to see what was happening. And when she did, she came down, she went into the kitchen, and she saw Charles stuffing her mom into the suitcase. She knew her mom was dead, and she knew Charles had killed her. In a panic, Charles then grabbed Dee around the neck, and he strangled her while saying, "I'm sorry." Dee then passed out, and as she did, Charles smashed her head against the floor multiple times. Thinking that Dee was dead, Charles picked her up, carried her upstairs, and put her in the bathtub. However, unbeknown to him, Dee had actually regained consciousness, but being incredibly brave and incredibly smart, she continued to pretend to be dead until Charles had left the house. Charles went downstairs and Dee could hear some noises. She said it was like scrubbing noises, it sounded like he was cleaning up. Neighbours also heard a disturbance, in the form of a crashing and screaming and shouting, and then a scuffle, before everything went quiet. As Charles left the home, she saw him carrying what she thought was a guitar case. We now know it's a suitcase, but she said that whatever it were, looked really heavy. Now, although Charles did only stab Christina once, that stab wound was 14 centimetres deep, and it penetrated both her heart and her lung. So you've got to think, I don't know how long it were between him stabbing her and putting her in the suitcase and taking it outside, but it can't have been that long because it was all in the same night. So just imagine the amounts of blood. And there was lots of blood, that much so that it was dripping from the suitcase. Charles dragged the suitcase containing Christina's body and he put it into his mum's car. He then drove his mum's car back to his mum's house. While there, he found some bricks and put them in the suitcase to weigh it down. He then went over to Diglis Bridge over the River Severn in Worcester and attempted to get rid of the suitcase. He first attempted to throw the suitcase over the railing into the water, but I assume it was too heavy, either which way he failed. So instead, he dragged the suitcase under the bridge and threw it into the river. Later on that morning, a dog walker noticed that there were a trail of blood along with drag marks. So they kind of thought something weren't right, and they phoned the police. The police then came out and searched the area, and did later on that night find Christina's body in the suitcase. When they did so, they also found Christina's blood on the railing of the bridge. Obviously, the blood on the railing had come from where he tried to chuck it over the railing, but he failed. And obviously, in that much of a panic and a tiz about getting rid of the body, he didn't even notice that all the blood oozing out of the suitcase was left on the railing. Now, let's bear in mind, this is all in the same day. It might seem like 2 different days because it was the night of the 9th, but it was actually the morning of the 10th, and then at the night of the 10th is when Christina's body was found. In the meantime, while this body's been found and the police are searching for it, Charles returned to Christina's house with a shovel. His intentions were to bury Dee. But he obviously got there, he walked up into the bathroom, and Dee wasn't in the bath where he'd left her. Now, I don't know what this incredibly brave young girl did after he'd left, but she was probably assuming that he weren't going to come back, or maybe she was terrified that he were. And Charles found Dee in her bed, very much alive. Now, at this point, all sorts are running around Charles's head. He's looking at her, she's alive, he doesn't know how it can be possible, he killed her. He assumed that she'd somehow got some medical assistance. So he stood there looking at this 8-year-old girl who he's fairly sure were dead, and there's so much running through his mind, which you'll see a little bit later on what was actually running through his mind. But he just says, I'd rather go to jail. And then he left the house, leaving Dee in bed. Now, I'm not sure what time that was, but it was the next morning that Dee phoned the police. And she did so on her mum's mobile phone. I don't know why she waited. She was scared, she was traumatised. I mean, come on, she's an 8-year-old girl, she doesn't need any more excuses. Of course, the police attended the house, and of course, Dee had injuries that were consistent with attempted strangulation. Later on that morning, Charles was arrested at his home address. He informed officers that he was on antipsychotic medication, and he had not taken it the previous day. However, the forensic psychiatrists doubted that he was ever on antipsychotic medication at all. When he was at the police station, Charles was deemed fit to be interviewed. So the interviews got underway. During those interviews, Charles explained to police that he thought Christina, bearing in mind this is his ex-girlfriend, was a transgender file that begins with a P. Duh. And that he was harbouring the child, Dee, in the house. He believed that Dee wasn't her daughter, and he'd gone to the house to save her. And that's why he took a suitcase to start with. His plan was to put Dee's things in there and then take her to her grandparents' house. He also admitted that he had his hands around Dee's neck for 20 to 30 seconds, and then admitted to banging her head on the floor. He didn't deny any of it. He went on to claim that he didn't know why he attacked Dee. When she came into the room, Christina was on the floor, and he was trying to put her into a suitcase. And ultimately, he just didn't want Dee to have to see that. He didn't want her to stare, he didn't want her to look. He also says he pretty much panicked, adding, I thought she was some fucking dwarf or something. But overall, he's always said he didn't want to kill Dee. At one point he said the reason he suffocated her was he wanted to go to sleep or something. But when she started choking, he realised that it was actually a child. And then she urinated, I sort of realised, stopped, and she'd already passed out. But he still constantly denied that he was trying to kill her. And Dee believes that too. She said while he was strangling her, he was saying something about sorry. I don't think he wanted to hurt me. I just think he didn't want to go to jail. I knew he murdered her. He knew I saw him. However, Charles did admit that he thought she was dead, and he also admitted going back intending to bury her. In interviews, he confirmed that when he went back to the house and saw Dee was alive, I stood there for a second and just said out loud, I'd rather go to jail. Now, you might be wondering about his mum's car. I mentioned Christina's blood was leaking out of the suitcase, and he'd put the suitcase into the car. Well, bloodstains were found on the rear seats of the car and on the door handles. So during the police interview, they asked if his mum had seen these stains and what she said about it. And he responded by telling the police officers that he just made some bullshit up. Of course, a post-mortem was carried out on Christina, and that revealed extensive bruising to the neck. A herringbone pattern mark with a Nike swash mark on her upper chest, which indicated a forceful stamp with a shod foot. Bruising to the back of the base of her neck and upper back. Lacerations and scratch marks to her mouth and lips. which could have been from attempts to suffocate her or smother her, or from direct blunt force trauma. She had 2 chipped teeth, bruises and red marks on her limbs, and a single stab wound in the front of the chest, which were 14 centimetres deep, and that was a fatal wound that went through her heart and a lung. In the aftermath, unsurprisingly, Dee was diagnosed with PTSD. She was also deemed very likely to have mental illnesses and depression in later life. Later on, a family member said, "She suffers from PTSD and vivid nightmares, and is scared that someone will hurt her again. She sobs and sobs, such raw sobs. It has caused her immense trauma, and she no longer trusts men." On the 12th of February 2021, 2 days after this had all happened, and only 1 day after Dee had informed the police, Charles Byrne appeared in Kidderminster Magistrates Court. He'd been charged with murder and attempted murder. While there, he only spoke to confirm his name, address and date of birth. The Deputy District Judge sent the case to the Crown Court. Charles was then examined by consultant forensic psychiatrists. That was on behalf of both the prosecution and the defence. They were trying to assess his fitness, ready for a plea or for possible defences to his charge. Now, we'll look at their findings in quite a bit of detail shortly, but in a nutshell, it was agreed by both sides that Charles was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, which resulted in him experiencing delusions, hallucinations, and disordered thoughts. His condition had not been previously diagnosed, nor had it been medicated, despite his previous claims. But there were indications, from his family history and his behavioural symptoms in adolescence, that it had been long-standing. At Warwick Crown Court on the 1st of June 2021, he said, "I plead not guilty, but guilty to manslaughter." Basically, he was denying murder. He was admitting that he'd murdered Christina Rowe, but it was on grounds of diminished responsibility, so he was only going to accept guilty to manslaughter. He also denied the attempted murder of Dee. Court was then adjourned to the 6th of December 2021, and it was on that day that he changed his plea. He was now also pleading guilty to the attempted murder of Dee. So now, although he's still not pleading guilty to Christina's murder, he is admitting to doing it. He's pleading guilty for manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, and he's also pleading guilty for attempted murder of Dee. His barrister read out the basis of the plea. "May I read into record on the basis of plea? The defendant pleads guilty on the following basis. He was seriously mentally unwell at the time of the incident, as referred in medical evidence." At the end of the court, the judge told Charles, "I must adjourn this matter for sentence, because it's acknowledged by both the prosecution and the defence in this case that you are psychiatrically unwell. Therefore, it is necessary I can properly take account of the true extent and nature of your psychiatric condition before I pass sentence. There will therefore be some delay in order so the defence and prosecution can properly investigate your mental health. Simply because I am adjourning the case for the benefit of your psychiatric report should not lead you or anybody else in court to assume I am minded to make psychiatric disposal of this case. All options plainly remain open to me when I sentence you next year." Charles Byrne was then remanded back into care at Ashworth High Security Hospital. Now, I think the psychiatric analysis is a major part of his case, and there is a lot to get through, because it does contain the view of 3 different doctors. I've tried my best to dumb it down, but if you want to skip this section, if you look down here at the chapters, I have added the chapters so you can go straight on to the sentencing. All the psychiatrists agreed that his mental health had improved since he'd been arrested and remanded in custody. The first doctor is Dr. Magantys. To him, Charles described that his mental health deteriorated in October. Charles went on to stick to his story, explaining that he thought Christina was a man who'd had a sex change operation to look like a woman. After a break in their relationship, him and Christina got back together in October 2020, but Charles continued to be very paranoid. Charles admitted to using cannabis and drank increasing amounts of alcohol. Their relationship came to its final end in January 2021, and as it did, he became increasingly worried that Christina was a male file word, and she was holding Dee. He added, "I wanted to take Dee from her." Talking about the night of the murder, he said that Dee walked in after he'd strangled and stabbed Christina. He said, "I panicked and strangled her. I should have picked her up and left, but I strangled her. It does not make any sense, I know." On the 30th of April 2021, he said, "That part of me thought she was a tiny little adult abusing people. I can't explain it really. I was in a weird way. It all felt so real at the time, and now it sounds crazy. None of it makes sense anymore, but at the time, it did. I felt that I had to do it as I felt compelled to do it. Then he talked about when he found Dee alive, and he said, I thought someone had a key to the house. The house was bugged, and we were all being watched. And I thought if I left, they would get her help. It doesn't make any sense now, but it did then. In Dr. Magantys' view, Charles would have known that he was attacking a human being, even though he was unable to identify the gender of a human being accurately and failed to recognise that she was his partner, rather than a member of the Illuminati. Therefore, he would have understood the nature and quality of his actions to the limited extent of recognising that he was killing a human being. In a further report on the 20th of January 2022, Dr. Magantys gave the opinion that a combination of his delusional beliefs, together with impaired thought process through which he was processing these delusions, led him to kill. The killing is directly attributable to his mental illness and was causative in the killing. The issue of culpability is for the court, but attributing significant culpability to such a disordered and severely ill mind and brain is difficult. He then deemed that the treatment required would be multifactorial and prolonged. He considered a prison custodial environment was not conducive to the treatment for those with treatment-resistant schizophrenia. The risk to the public would be better managed by a hospital order with restrictions rather than a hybrid order. The second doctor was Dr. Kennedy, and Charles gave him pretty much the same reasons. In Dr. Kennedy's opinion, from his description of the homicide, there is no evidence to suggest that he either did not know what he was doing or did not know it was illegally wrong. I do not therefore believe that a defence of insanity is available to him for either charge. He carried out the homicide and removed the body from the scene in an attempt to conceal what he had done. There is also a suggestion from Dee that she heard him scrubbing. He denies this. There is a suggestion that he partially believed that Dee was an adult of restricted growth disguised as a child. I note, however, that he clearly, by his own account, believed that she was a victim of a conspiracy. There is nothing in his history, or from my examination of the records, to suggest he was unable to form intent to kill at the time he strangled the deceased's daughter. Whether he did so is a question of fact. Dr. Kennedy described the offences as particularly brutal. He still didn't understand why Charles did what he did to Dee, on the basis that he'd gone to the house intending to save her. There remains the strong possibility that he did so to prevent her from calling the police. In Dr. Kennedy's opinion, the complex delusional system from which Charles suffered substantially impaired his ability to exercise self-control and form rational judgment. This is because his paranoid and persecutory delusions were clearly of prime importance to him and were impervious to reasoning. I do note, however, that he was able to set these ideas aside at time of both speaking to people and in his communications with the deceased. It would be my opinion that the psychosis provided a credible explanation for the offence. It was also said that the mental illness was independent of substance abuse. Now I'm going to say that again because there's lots of defenders out there that like to tell me off. The past drug use is not being blamed for Charles's mental illness. The prognosis is guarded. Any recovery is likely to remain fragile. Were he to cease medication, it is likely that the positive symptoms would return within a short space of time. The medication he is given is only available on long-term basis in tablet form, and is a medication which prompts a rapid deterioration in mental state if the patient discontinues it. Dr. Kennedy also couldn't see how Charles could cope with a custodial setting. He also suggested an hospital order with restrictions. The third and final doctor is Dr. Higgins. She is Charles's treating clinician. And in her clinical opinion, Charles's offending was highly and directly attributable to his illness, and his mental disorder provided the only possible explanation for this offence. The risk posed in the future is solely dependent on the mental disorder, and there's no additional risks that would need to be assessed by the parole board in order to direct an eventual release into the community. She gave evidence in court on the 25th of March 2022. She said at the time of the police interviews, Charles was floridly psychotic. He remained completely and utterly disconnected from reality. She thought his actions surrounding the events, including cleaning up, disposing of the body, and his conduct towards Dee, were entirely coloured by his illness. His offending was highly and directly attributable to his paranoid schizophrenia. The safest way for all concerned was to manage Charles was by a hospital order with restriction in order to enforce compliance with the medication. In court, she was asked about the attempted murder of Dee, and Dr. Kennedy's thoughts on it being a strong possibility that he only attempted to kill her to stop her from phoning the police. She said, "That is Dr. Kennedy's view. I respect that. Certainly in a subsequent multiple times I've spoke to Mr. Byrne, he hasn't particularly used that. It doesn't make sense to me as well, just as a standalone reason." In sentencing, the judge saw that Charles had a long history of mental issues and suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, as well as the mental illness being highly and directly attributable to the offences. He acknowledged that it was incredibly unwell, that he did believe that Christina was a file, and that Dee was at risk. However, he noted that when Dee interrupted Charles, his instinct weren't that, "Yay, I've saved her," it was that he should kill her. So the judge was satisfied that the reason Charles attempted to kill Dee wasn't because she was a dwarf file in disguise, it was because she was a witness. He believed that Charles was not only capable, but specifically intended to kill both victims. He also added that Charles knew that his condition was adversely affected by the abuse of alcohol and illicit drugs, but still smoked strong skunk cannabis and drank spirits in the 48 hours before the offence. He also noted Dr. Higgins' evidence that Charles used alcohol and drugs to self-medicate. With all the above in mind, the judge determined the level of retained responsibility was to the higher end of the medium range. So the sentence starting point for the manslaughter charge was 17 years. And that's before considering the mitigating and aggregating factors. The aggregating factors are, it was a spontaneous explosion of extreme violence, the use of a knife, the offence happened in Christina's home at night, the presence of Dee, and the disposal of Christina's body. For the mitigating factors, Charles' mental illness was not taken into account because it was used for the culpability, which affects the starting point. But the mitigating factors were the lack of premeditation. Charles had no previous convictions, positive evidence of Charles's previous good character, his age and his genuine remorse for his actions. He was also awarded full credits for his guilty pleas. The appropriate sentence for Christina's manslaughter alone would have been 14 years in prison. But then there's also the attempted murder of Dee. It was acknowledged that both the assault and witnessing a mom's murder will have caused a serious and long-term psychological damage. So the level of harm was placed into category 2. However, Charles' responsibility was reduced by his mental disorder. So the starting point for that one was 15 years in prison. After the discount for his guilty plea, his sentence was 13.5 years in prison. The judge noted that the psychiatrist had a unanimous opinion regarding the hospital order with restrictions. Nevertheless, the judge decided he couldn't really see a good reason why a penile element shouldn't be included. Charles was sentenced to life, with a minimum of 16 years. But he was also charged for 13 years and 6 months for the attempted murder of Dee, to be served concurrently. So Charles will be continued to be cared for in Ashworth High Security Hospital. However, if and when he is assessed to be fit to leave, he will be taken to prison to serve the rest of his sentence. Charles did appeal this sentence, and quite interestingly, despite the ton of news articles about the case and the other court hearings, I couldn't really find any news articles about the appeal. But I know it happened, and I know it happened last month, December 2022, because I've read the entire appeal. It's 12 pages long. And I'm not going to get into the appeal in great detail, this video is already long enough. But his defence, which was the same team that fought for him in court, basically said that it was contradictory in a few places. For example, the judge factored in that Charles did alcohol and illicit drugs within 48 hours before the crime, and that would exacerbate his condition. But the defence used that and referred it back to Dr. Kennedy's evidence. Now, Dr. Kennedy's evidence actually said the mental illness was independent of alcohol and drug use. It never, from what I've read, said that it won't exacerbate it. And I mean, I think it's a very weak argument, because if you Google that question, there's tons and tons of articles, and they all say alcohol, that's the only one I searched, will exacerbate schizophrenia. So they actually got the words, they played about with him a little bit, they didn't actually take the words at their exact meaning. Now that is pretty much the end, but there is a little bit more I've got for you. You see, the photographer friend that I mentioned at the beginning spoke to the Mirror newspaper, and he said a little bit of extra information that I couldn't find very much of online, so I thought rather than trying to report it, I'll just take the quote. Here's what he said. It was a difficult one because we didn't really know the extent of everything. We didn't know about him stalking or kidnapping them. I don't think they were together when I gave her a friendly warning to be careful around him, but they were still talking. I was concerned for her. He was behaving erratically and was quite aggressive and controlling. She came to stay with me with her daughter for a bit, and I later found out that he would turn up at her house at the middle of the night. But he does go on, but it's the kidnapping thing that really caught my attention. And I didn't include it at the beginning of the story, because like I said, I couldn't find much more about it. But apparently, they were both kidnapped, both Christina and Dee, a couple of days before the murder happened. And after reportedly holding them against their will for a couple of hours, he let them go. And he was never convicted for that offence. One more final insight, just so we're unbiased. This statement was written by Charles's family, and it was read out by his defence. Our hearts are broken for Christina's family, although we cannot begin to know their pain. In the 20 months leading up to February 2021, we tried everything possible to get the help Charlie desperately needed. It is shameful that the first time he was seen by a psychiatrist was after his arrest. No other families should ever have to suffer a tragedy like this. That is all I've got for you. What do you think? It is a very strange one. First of all, do you think that he actually thought Christina was a trans file? And if you do you actually think he went in there to save Dee? And if he did go in to save Dee, did he intend to kill her because she was a witness, or did he think she was a dwarf file? Now, the hardest thing about doing a story like this for me, not only because there's lots of reading and I hate reading to a microphone, but the hardest thing about doing this story for me is it's always the kids. The kids are always the victims, and people say, well, what if the kids watch it? Well, first of all, if the kids watch it, that's up to them. I see myself as a journalist, and as long as you're not fabricating to make it entertaining, I don't see how any true crime is not seen as journalism. But I do it for good reasons. I always try to be helpful and put helpful information at the end. But if nothing else, it's for educational purposes. Only by knowing what's happening and what is going on is the only way we can make society safer and better. I also like to think I pay tribute to the victims and make sure the perpetrators are known for what they did. Again, if you search for victims' names on Google, my video is not the first thing that comes up. It's all the news articles. So I'm not putting it out there necessarily any more than that's already out there. And I put this in the description of every video. I do this for good reasons. As many of you always say, it does mean a lot to me, and I am sensitive to it. So if you are thinking, well, that poor child and you're putting this video out, don't. Because this story is absolutely harrowing. And against all odds, I hope Dee recovers mentally from this. Obviously, it's something she'll never forget, and she shouldn't have to learn to live with it. But I hope she does, and I hope karma treats her really good for the rest of her life. Because that is totally not fair, it's not right, it shouldn't happen, it should never happen. If you've got mental health issues, or if you know somebody that has, please do look down in the description below. I'm sorry that this video was very quotey and very reader, but I wanted for once to actually put some psychological information in here. I enjoyed writing it, not so much reading it out, because like I said, I hate doing that. Let me know what you think of this style of video. Until next time, guys, goodbye.